In recent times, we have seen an increasingly sizable amount of ethnic minorities in British Parliament, with 10% of elected MPs in the 2019 general election being of various diverse backgrounds. With a wider pool of MPs that are ethnic minorities, this has inevitably led to more ethnic minorities holding ministerial positions in the cabinet and eventually the first non-white Prime Minister. For a fairly lengthy period of time during the reign of the second Johnson ministry, there was more racial diversity than Labour's shadow cabinet. Even though this is by the margin of a single individual, this is honestly quite remarkable considering the right-wing bench looks like this.
I like your cut, G.
While the left looks like this. Needless to say, a diverse parliament is essential when 15% of the population is of minority ethnic groups, to ensure that the people enacting policies and voting on bills are representative of the people that they govern. This obviously extends to sexual minorities and disabled people, however, in this video I'll be solely focusing on race and religion. Now, the notable rise in inclusivity from these events have garnered quite the praise for a seemingly progressive milestone from both the media and those who feel a cultural or social association to these politicians. However, on deeper inspection, we find that these Tories of colour actively engage in movements that are antithetical to the progression of minorities to get ahead, and in this video I will be taking you through a deep dive into a few of the most notable conservative minorities and understand why Tory diversity will never matter. While it may seem logical to start off with the holder of the most remarkable milestone, that being Rishi Sunak, I think it will be far more interesting to start off with politicians that probably share a more relatable upbringing and their journey to the ruling class. Nevertheless, if you are here for specific individuals, then direct yourself with the chapter markers below. Let's first start off with the cynically intolerant queen of deportations and former Home Secretary Priti Patel, whose parents emigrated to the UK in the 60s from Uganda and built their own chain of newsagents in London, or newsstands for the non-British viewers. Their relocation was prompted by claims of persecution. To give some context, from 1895 to 1962, Britain sent tens and thousands of South Asians from India to Uganda as a means to serve as middlemen in relation to business, trade and administration, with many of them serving as indentured labourers who worked on the construction of the Uganda Railway. After its completion, a few thousand workers remained in Uganda, in which Britain then decided to invest in the education of the Asian minority that remained, with a preference over the native Ugandans, leading many of them to be more employable. The South Asian population grew to approximately 80,000 and owned 20% of the national income, despite them only making roughly 1% of the population. This resulted in strong anti-Indian sentiment among the native Ugandans, and when a brutal autocrat became president, he ordered the expulsion of all South Asians, confiscating all property and valuable goods in the process. To Priti's advantage, her parents migrated to the UK prior to Idi Amin becoming president of Uganda, meaning they were most likely able to maintain predisposed wealth, enabling them to start their own chain of newsagents. The fact that her parents were able to migrate easily by virtue of not discriminating against quote-unquote unskilled workers has undoubtedly improved the quality of her life, evident by where she is now. Yet, despite this, Priti Patel is staunchly against relaxed immigration. She herself has admitted that her own parents would have not been able to migrate to the UK had the Brexit immigration system existed back then. Priti did later go on to claim that as her parents were subject to mistreatment, they could have applied as asylum seekers, which quite frankly is a load of horse shit, given that her Nationality and Borders Bill makes this far more difficult and even deems refugees inadmissible to claim asylum if they do not take an official route, which, for the record, is extremely restricted and inaccessible for most asylum seekers. This bill also extends to criminalise those who help refugees even in the case of legal arrivals, meaning rescue services such as the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, who often transfer refugees from dinghies and onto safe, reliable lifeboats, will be charged for the crime of saving lives. Priti even went as far as to propose a scheme that would deport refugees who didn't take these official routes to Rwanda in an attempt to deter entry to the United Kingdom, Now, if you weren't already convinced of the heinously unrivaled void of empathy beholden by this woman, then perhaps you will by the fact that even the UK considers Rwanda to have serious human rights issues, which led the European Court of Human Rights to intervene and cancel the first scheduled flight. Now, in contrast to this, the UK has actually taken over 100,000 Ukrainian refugees as of recording this video, despite there being many cases of Ukrainian refugees being turned away by British officials for not having the required paperwork. The atrocities that Ukraine is facing are widely sympathized with, and many comparable European OECD nations have taken in even more refugees during the start of the war. Had the UK maintained its strict immigration stance, it would look very bad on the global scale and go against British geopolitical interests, hence why we are seeing a stark difference in the attitude of Tories, including Priti, regarding refugees from Ukraine compared to those from countries such as Afghanistan. This ideologically inconsistent act of good is clearly steered by political strategy rather than a moral obligation. What makes this entire circumstance worse is that in 2013, Priti's father Sajid Patel became a candidate for fucking UKIP. To put that in perspective, Sajid Patel, who fled from racial persecution in one country, then joins a fascist party in another country that supports white ethno-nationalism, is anti-immigration, and if they were to be in power, they would enact policies that would create similar outcomes to what Sajid faced in Uganda. If this wasn't enough cockholding, Priti Patel's political idol is none other than Margaret Thatcher, who once during a TV interview famously said, "I am the first to admit it is not easy to get clear figures from the Home Office about immigration, but there was a committee which looked at it and said that if we went on as we are, then by the end of the century there would be 4 million people of the new Commonwealth or Pakistan here." Now, that is an awful lot, and I think it means that the people are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And, you know, the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there is any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in. I don't know what is more absurd in that statement, the claim of British character being a champion of democracy, or the very racist implication that immigrants of a different culture are barbaric fiends that are inept to law and order. Priti, is this really the graven image you aspire to be like? One that would likely be antipathetic to having the daughter of Indian immigrants in charge of our national security. Going back to Priti's background, before she became the former Home Secretary, she studied economics at university and acquired a master's in British government before joining the Conservative Party in 1997 for 3 years. Prior to rejoining the Conservative Party, Priti worked in various other jobs, such as in corporate relations for an alcoholic beverage company, and more importantly, as a strategic advisor for a PR consultant, where she was involved in a rather dubious assignment that I'll come back to later. But to stay on topic, there is honestly a great deal of hard work that Priti Patel has put in to get to where she is now. And if you combine her work ethic with a narrow-minded conservative mindset, she is primed to believe in the capitalist fallacy of meritocracy with her lived experience alone. Though what strikes me is the fact her own success story doesn't convince her to be in favour of a more relaxed immigration system, especially given that the neoliberal movement that Thatcher brought to the UK has expanded to take a more relaxed approach to immigration elsewhere. It's honestly quite fascinating how her belief of meritocracy and need for validation from other conservatives leads her to have extremely short-sighted opinions, as she once quoted, "Importantly for me, I never want people to think I got on because I tick a box, because I am Asian or a woman. You get here on your own merit." Now, this is a very common conservative talking point, the notion of a colourblind society. Some often go as far as quoting MLK in bad faith, which is used frequently to undermine the very real material and social struggles of minorities, or used in an attempt to establish yourself as different and more hardworking compared to other minorities. Ultimately, this line of argument is absurd for multiple reasons. Firstly, there is an immediate presumption that the person is not qualified for the position, and their identity is primarily or solely the main point of consideration, which is very rarely ever the case. Secondly, this fails to acknowledge barriers that have been overcome due to their identity, which their default counterpart didn't have to face. And lastly, having varying identities opens up the door to provide a wider spectrum of opinions, insights, and attention to marginalized issues. The reality of the matter is that your identity makes a difference. By discarding this context, it is incredibly ignorant and disingenuous. Matters like this should definitely be taken into consideration, even more in the case of a governing body. Now, to no surprise, Priti's stubbornly authoritarian intolerance doesn't just stop at refugees and other minorities, but in any form of social justice, as demonstrated in her response to the toppling of Edward Colston's statue, a British merchant and slave trader who is estimated to have transported 84,000 slaves from West Africa to the Americas. As expected, she had a standard reactionary view towards this, condemning the act, stating that it was utterly disgraceful and repetitively griping about public disorder. All this while failing to acknowledge even in the slightest why the glorification of a racist who brought so much suffering to generations of black people is extremely disdainful, and why this would drive people to do such a thing during the BLM protests. Priti's Oathkeeper simping opinions didn't even alter in the case of Winston Churchill's statue being vandalized, despite the fact that Churchill's colonial policies and lack of relief being responsible for the death of over 3 million from the man-made Bengal famine. This shouldn't come as a surprise for someone who has commented on his hatred for Indians and how he viewed them as beastly people with a beastly religion. Even if all of this can be looked past for what is regarded as his more positive wartime efforts that I would personally argue should be attributed elsewhere, it is very strange for someone who is of Indian descent to not at least address Churchill's cruel racist past, and how the notion of Churchill being a national hero above everything else is condescending. Priti is the epitome of why Tory diversity will never matter, and hence I have a lot to say, but we'll revisit her later. Let's move on to Sajid Javid now, who, out of all the people we'll be looking at today, had the most modest upbringing. Sajid's family, who were originally from Pakistan, also migrated to the UK in the 60s like Priti's parents. His father started off as a bus driver before taking over a shop in Bristol where their family of 7 lived in a 2-bedroom flat above it. Before Sajid got into politics, he had a very successful 18-year-long banking career, working in various banks and eventually climbing up the ranks to become a managing director at Deutsche Bank, earning roughly 3 million a year. Sajid's successful banking career was largely achieved by overcoming obstacles induced by not having the most fortunate upbringing, especially compared to most of his colleagues. One of these obstacles even included being denied the ability to study maths at O-level, so he had to get his father to buy his way through, and later he was restricted to only 2 A-levels when he needed 3 to go to university, prolonging his education by having to attend college as a prerequisite. One thing to note is that Sajid and Priti are the only 2 out of 5 politicians I'll be covering who attended public school. Now, going to a public school does not obstruct you from achieving well in your academics, but we can't dismiss the advantage of those who are exposed to better quality education from a younger age, enabling them to get further with less effort, even if they are held to higher standards. Furthermore, Sajid's eagerness to further himself from a young age led him to venture into the world of stocks, borrowing money from his bank at the expense of financial risks to him and his family. This self-centered acquisitiveness is something that is rather foreshadowing of his political career and general personality, as we'll come to see. Now, we don't know how profitable Sajid's father's store was, but even if his family was better off than the typical working class family, his upbringing does capture some working class struggle. Though, despite this, Sajid has consistently voted in favour of austerity and privatisation of public services that make life harder and more expensive for working class families. Of course, this is expected of a conservative, though even if Sajid was genuinely a die-hard capitalist who believed in meritocracy to the core, it is extremely ignorant to deny that austerity diminishes the degree of success stories like Sajid by virtue of diminishing upward mobility for those with underprivileged spawn points. Since the age of austerity under the Cameron and Clegg coalition, there have been significant drawbacks to the quality of life, such as the increase of children living in relative poverty by over 600,000, disproportionately affecting ethnic minorities, the reliance on food banks increasing almost every year, and the continuously growing number of people living in temporary accommodation. Now, obviously, this entire argument does not pertain to Sajid's ethnic or religious identity. A white English person is not exempt from being a heartless opportunist like Sajid, though I brought this up because this really delineates his character and gives us more insight to Sajid's actions. So moving on to a matter that is relevant to Sajid's identity, he has actually been fairly vocal about racial abuse that he's faced. Instances from physical and verbal abuse from National Front skinheads during his younger days to religious hate mail in 2018 in the form of a Punish a Muslim Day parcel. Despite this, Sajid himself has peddled Muslim grooming gang propaganda by tweeting about Asian paedophiles in relation to the conviction of 20 child rapists in 2018. Now yes, all of the culprits in this case were indeed of South Asian descent, with most of them being Pakistani, but this goes a lot deeper than that. For the longest time, British media outlets have been pounding agitprop of Muslim grooming gangs, and there was even a maliciously misleading study that furthers this notion by Quilliam, a think tank that claims to counter extremism, specifically against Islam. For the record, Quilliam is not at all a reputable institution. They have received funding from a far-right evangelical organisation and has links with notorious far-right figures in the UK. Now, what you find out on deeper inspection of these sources is that the term grooming gang itself is one that was coined by right-wingers to perpetuate this narrative that Asian Muslims are committing child sex abuses at an ungodly margin by virtue of it being tolerated in their religious doctrine. But when we look at child sexual exploitation as a whole in the UK, we find that 85% of the offenders are white, while Asians only make up 4% of the offenders. Yet, when the culprits are white, even in the case of grooming gangs, we don't see the labelling of their identity. Now sure, there is a much larger white population than Asians in the UK, but nonetheless, the overwhelming archetype is not an ethnicity or religion, it's men. A YouTuber by the name of Lonerbox has covered this in extensive detail. If you are interested, the link will be in the description. But to bring this back to Sajid, during 2018, when he was the Home Secretary, he made Asian grooming gangs a big focus point during his reign. Even if Sajid was conscientious of this false narrative, it honestly doesn't matter to him. You see, all of this was going towards building up his image and favourability for the impending Conservative leadership race in the following year. Now, being in a party that is notorious for allegations of Islamophobia and has also garnered voters with like-minded views, this is nothing more than a clear attempt to pander towards right-wingers who are likely to be predisposed to bigoted views due to the media they consume and their environment. One thing to note is that despite Sajid being raised Muslim, he does not practice Islam himself, though he does identify as Muslim when it benefits him, such as the time he received an award for Politician of the Year at the British Muslim Awards, and when he remarked about being the first Muslim Home Secretary. But in other cases, Sajid tries to distance himself away from Islam for his own interests, or make him seem like he is more rational than other Muslims and is willing to critique his faith, one that he doesn't even follow himself. The fact of the matter is, as much as Sajid tries to distance himself away from his Muslim identity, he will always be too Muslim for the Conservative Party, a party that has had senior members peddle conspiracies of British schools being radicalised by Islamic extremism, a mayoral candidate who claimed that accommodating to Muslims and Hindus robs Britain of its community, and a former Prime Minister that uses the excuse of a joke to dog whistle about Muslim women wearing burqas looking like letterboxes or bank robbers, is not a party that is ready to have a Muslim be an icon of their values, even if he supports everything that they want. In relation to this topic, Sajid has denied a request from the Muslim Council of Britain to conduct an inquiry regarding allegations of Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. To be good faith here, the Muslim Council of Britain has historically had some controversies, including homophobia and harmful views regarding sex ed. Even though there has been a push for more tolerance in recent years, there is some tangible substance to why someone wouldn't want to engage in a discourse with the MBC. Having said this, what I find interesting is that one of Sajid's reasoning for turning them down was because he believed they had favourable comments on extremists. Though in 2017, when Sajid was business secretary, he continued to grant export licenses for weapons to Saudi Arabia, who is known to be committing frequent war crimes in Yemen. He also ignored a senior civil servant who advised otherwise and declared that he wouldn't suspend licenses until evidence of a clear risk threshold has been breached. This is total bullshit. Saudi Arabia is Britain's biggest weapons client, purchasing over 20 billion worth of military equipment since their intervention in Yemen. Many of their bombs, missiles and aircrafts that are being directed at non-military zones, resulting in the deaths of tens and thousands of civilians, were sold by the UK. Sajid really has no room to talk about extremism and is only willing to express racial injustice up until action is required, or in some cases actively engage in it for his own gain. Moving on, another highly notable characteristic of Sajid is that he is one of the staunchest defenders of Israel. Throughout his career, Sajid has threatened to cancel Europe's largest Palestine convention as well as cut funds for cultural institutions that boycott Israel, in which a judge ruled that Sajid acted unlawfully by attempting to restrict local councils from preventing pension scheme funds to companies that are complicit with Israeli occupation of Palestine. Furthermore, Sajid is a long-time supporter of Conservative Friends of Israel, having attended many of their events and, on a more brighter outlook, has spoken out against anti-Semitism on multiple occasions. Now, there isn't too much data available for the political leanings of British Jewish people prior to the 2015 election, though since then they've typically been in favour of voting Conservative, which was further solidified following the extreme slander of Jeremy Corbyn and fabricated allegations of anti-Semitism by the British media. The minority of Jewish Labour voters have then demonstrably decreased, with many of them shifting towards Lib Dems and Tory. The studies that I have found are conducted by a hard-right weekly newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, and thus should be naturally taken with a high degree of skepticism. Though, having said that, there is a decent degree of detail gone into these sources where it would be redundant to form fraudulent data, as there isn't too much to gain, given most readers clearly have predefined ideological positions if they are reading the Jewish Chronicle. I've posted links to the sources in the description if you want to have a look for yourself, but to get back on topic, there is an older study by them in 2010 with a sample size of 1,000 Jewish people, which shows that political leanings were evenly split. Though in 2015, when most Jewish voters were settled on the Tories, a poll of 566 Jewish people revealed that 60% believed the Conservative Party had better policies for Israel and the Middle East, whereas Labour only received 7.5% of the votes. What's interesting is that both party leaders at the time, Ed Miliband and David Cameron, were in favour of a two-state solution. The only difference is that David Cameron was far less critical of Israel's morally indefensible actions. The obvious conclusion to discern here is that the Jewish vote is heavily dependent on party views regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict, hence why Labour became increasingly unpopular when someone who has been a long-standing campaigner for the recognition of Palestine and is highly critical of Israel's government became the party leader. Now, Sajid Javid has established himself as an opportunist on multiple occasions, and it doesn't seem any different in this case. Whilst the Jewish demographic is very marginal, one's opinion on the Israel-Palestine conflict heavily dictates your public image, as we saw from Ed Miliband and especially Corbyn. This also appeals to many non-Jewish Western right-wingers, from chauvinistic geopolitical reasonings to outrageous religious beliefs, and as someone who is a regular attendee of neoconservative conferences that includes the likes of Dick Cheney and John Bolton, this is definitely the audience that he wants to capture. To caveat this, I do want to mention that there may be a certain degree of sincerity here to Sajid's convictions, despite his track record not supporting that, but I do want to give him the benefit of the doubt, because unlike Priti Patel, Sajid has shown a handful of redeemable qualities, from funding $4.5 million for a campaign to tackle anti-LGBT hate crime when he was the Home Secretary, to calling for stricter censorship on social media to curb extremist content in the aftermath of the Christchurch mosque shootings. His contributions have helped form the Online Safety Bill that aims to create more regulations for social media sites and hold them accountable for negligent misconduct. While there shouldn't be an expectation for Sajid to lean on the side of Palestine in this conflict on the basis of him being culturally Muslim, it is very disingenuous to be such a fervent Israel defender while completely avoiding the racism and Islamophobia that is fueled by Israel to rationalize their horrific actions. Indoctrination through education to IDF training has delivered a sense of racial superiority, leading to such hostile attitudes towards Palestinians and Islamic practices. Even the mere act of children throwing rocks at soldiers as a visceral response to their material conditions leads them to routine detainment, or sometimes even worse. Given that Sajid has been vocal about racial and religious discrimination in other contexts, but he has shown a blind eye here, really stipulates that he values the benefits of being an unequivocal supporter of Israel over being morally consistent. Before concluding this chapter, I want to bring back the point I made earlier about Priti Patel's involvement in what I described as a dubious assignment. This took place during her time as a strategic advisor for the PR consulting firm Weber Shandwick prior to her political success. Working in a small team of 7, Priti was tasked with improving the public image of British American Tobacco, a multinational company that is engaged in various unethical practices, most notably with their factory in Burma, where workers were paid poverty wages and funds were used to prop a military dictatorship. An employee at British American Tobacco later went on to complain about the discomfort of Weber-Shandwick workers during this assignment. However, they did mention that Priti was relaxed on the matter. Though we can't take this as hard evidence, it is not something that is difficult to believe in given Priti's political track record, and for me this is a moment that defines Priti's character. When presented with a possibility to acquire something and contribute to upward mobility, morality is rarely something to be considered for people like Priti Patel and Sajid Javid. So long they do not face the consequences of their own actions, it doesn't matter if they had a more relatable upbringing when they are directly making it harder for other people of similar backgrounds to climb up the socio-economic ladder as a means to gain and maintain power, because as demonstrated by their actions time and time again, they are nothing more than self-serving opportunists. Let's start this chapter by looking into Kwasi Kwarteng, who, despite making a horrendous chancellor, actually demonstrated exceptional success in his academics before his time in politics. Like many wealthy Tories, Kwasi went to Eton College, one of the most prestigious colleges in the country, which was attended by 20 prime ministers, before studying classics and history at Cambridge, achieving a first on both subjects. Prior to earning a PhD in economic history, he even attended Harvard University on a Kennedy Scholarship, where up to 10 British postgrads that have performed outstandingly well in their education are selected. This is irrespective of financial background and serves more like a trophy than a program to help those with less fortunate circumstances. Throughout Kwasi's academics, he has received numerous scholarships under similar conditions and achieved various notable awards for his educational accomplishments, even appearing on University Challenge at one point. With all this context provided, it is clear that Kwasi is undoubtedly a diligent and studious individual who seemingly deserves the various political positions he's held if we were to go purely off by merit. The extent of Kwasi's outstanding academic performance is one that the vast majority of people cannot relate to, and arguably the biggest factor of this can be attributed to the lack of opportunity to access the quality of education Kwasi was exposed to from the get-go. Now, being disconnected from the reality of others is quite a common occurrence in Kwasi's political career, with a notable example being the 2005 election where he was a Conservative candidate for Brent East in London. Going off the census from 2001, 55% of the people that resided in the borough of Brent were of black or Asian ethnic groups. This has since then increased, now sitting at 64% as of 2021. To no surprise, ethnic minorities are disproportionately more likely to reside in impoverished neighbourhoods, and Brent is a clear reflection of that, with significantly higher poverty and unemployment rates than the average of London. A Conservative candidate has not won a seat in any Brent constituency since 1992, and as expected, Kwasi didn't do great, finishing behind both Labour and Liberal Democrat candidates. Just like many of the notorious Conservative figures of modern politics, Kwasi is a Thatcherite who is hugely in favour of austerity and has argued for the need to radically shrink welfare states with the belief that benefits should be a reward of contributions. Typical pull yourself by the bootstraps Conservative rhetoric. People are obviously more likely to be reliant on welfare states if they are unable to find ways to contribute to the economy, which ultimately means there is more blame to be attributed to the governing body of a country than individuals. And of course, this completely neglects disabled and sick people who are unable to work. It's also rich hearing this from someone who never had and never will be reliant on the welfare state for their sustenance, and makes me question why the Conservatives nominated him as their candidate for Brent. Sure, there is undoubtedly a chance that they saw Kwasi to be the most suitable for the job, though when he is so disconnected from the needs of the people in Brent, it makes it hard to dismiss the possibility of this being a ploy to garner minority votes. To be clear, this is by no means to undermine the importance of considering identity in these matters, as I've already established, but to criticise when this is done superficially. After all, success stories like Kwasi are appealing to working class minorities, no matter how detached they are from people like him. Funnily enough, when Kwasi later became the Conservative candidate for Spelthorne, a borough that is 91% white and would be considered affluent on a national level, he successfully won a seat at every general election, and is still the incumbent. Kwasi isn't looking to help improve the lives of minorities or offer adequate opportunities to prosper. He has a set of unrelenting reactionary ideas that he expects others to follow to achieve success, while completely dismissing the material disadvantages of many working class minorities. Look no further than his failed mini-budget proposal as Chancellor, where he opted to aid the wealthy through numerous tax cuts than assist the vulnerable during a cost of living crisis. Kwasi's neglectful ignorance extends to even his own identity, being of Ghanaian descent, as Black Africans are reported to have the least household wealth on average. And this is not his only instance where he's been woefully dismissive of his community. In 2011, he published his first book, Ghost of Empire: Britain's Legacies in the Modern World, which, as clearly stated in its name, is about the legacy of the British Empire. This is a fairly lengthy book that would warrant its own video, so for the sake of time, I will summarise it. Kwasi was inspired by another book called Empire, written by a Scottish historian that viewed the British Empire through a neoconservative lens, in which he suggested that if concepts of liberal democracy, free trade and capitalism were seen as good, then other countries would appreciate if they were forced to adopt it. This was intriguing to Kwasi because during university, he claimed that he was only taught about colonialism and the British Empire through a quote-unquote Marxist lens of exploitation, essentially playing with the whole cultural Marxist conspiracy, which proposes that higher education in Western countries have been infiltrated by Marxist scholars that are pushing a far-left agenda onto educational curriculums. So, most of the book is spent recounting historical events and criticizing the governance of the empire, stating that it was too autocratic and monarchy-like, which led to the empire's downfall, and that colonies that belonged to other superpowers like the French were better governed in a more pragmatic and systematic fashion. In the end, Kwasi comes to the conclusion that both the neoconservative and Marxist viewpoints are imperfect, and that the empire should be viewed through its own lens. Despite the book being clear and well written, Kwasi really fails to substantiate anything meaningful. In essence, he is practically doing the enlightened centrist meme where he claims that both sides are bad but predominantly agrees with the right, even going as far as to claim that there are some justifications for fascism and slavery. Even though Kwasi stated that the empire was not wholly good nor wholly bad, he gives far more credit to the empire for their introduction of what Kwasi views as bringing justice to an anarchic country than any criticism. Now, these so-called good elements of British colonisation is a very common conservative talking point that is extremely short-sighted for a few reasons. Firstly, we don't know how former colonies would have developed had they not been exploited and robbed of their natural resources and labour. Secondly, there is a presumption that these countries also had the same primary goal of furthering the development of their economy in a profit-orientated, hierarchical manner seen in established capitalist nations of the time, which would self-justify brutal imperialistic endeavours. Lastly, there is a presumption that these countries are underdeveloped in all aspects, which is categorically false, as there is evidence of further social and technological advancements in many former colonies, such as the development of iron metallurgy in Africa that predates findings in Europe. Moreover, even if Kwasi avoided mentioning the negative aspects of British colonialism in any meaningful capacity to provide a unique perspective, it is incredibly disingenuous as someone who presents themselves as a historic academic to not equally expound on the many events that occurred under colonialism which do not support his political interests, as these matters ultimately shape what these former colonies have become today. Taking Kwasi's country of Ghana, which was then called Gold Coast, has endured exploitation of natural resources, distortion of cultural and religious identity, and of course brutality through the transatlantic slave trade. To underweigh the traumatic hardships faced because there has been positive outcomes of colonialism is not far-fetched from saying that chattel slavery is ultimately not bad because it allowed the descendants of slaves to become American citizens. The instability that is often caused to these countries after colonial periods dictates the material conditions for many people, and to someone who is evidently intelligent and well informed as Kwasi, I don't think this is a point of ignorance, but rather a tactical opportunist move to appease to a certain audience and get ahead in his career. Kwasi has even gone as far as to mischaracterize the concept of decolonization within an educational context, as if it inaccurately depicts historical events and provides a cartoonish analysis. Just like Priti Patel, Kwasi has also voiced his disapproval over the toppling of Edward Colston, which is very hypocritical from someone who staunchly believes in viewing history in an objective and thorough manner, as this is antithetical to the very point of a statue, that being to whitewash and glorify an individual. Now, when talking about politicians being disengaged from the reality of average people, we obviously have to talk about the richest member in parliament and current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Rishi was born into a comfortable upper middle class family with a general practitioner for a father and a pharmacist for a mother who ran her own pharmacy. After attending one of the country's most prestigious boarding schools, he was able to get a degree at Oxford and subsequently a Masters of Business Administration at Stanford University, where he met his wife Akshata Murthy. As the daughter of an Indian billionaire who owns the second largest Indian IT company that herself has a 0.1% stake of, Akshata's net worth is estimated to be about 500 million and has a non-dom status, enabling her to not pay taxes on income acquired abroad. Now, prior to becoming the Prime Minister, Rishi was most memorably known as the Chancellor during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, where he was in charge of mitigating its economic impacts and, just like most other countries, delivered a furlough scheme. While undoubtedly being the logical action here, there were hundreds and thousands of people who were unable to get this assistance had they started a new job where they were not on the payroll by a specific date. This was made more difficult by the intolerant restrictions to existing welfare and, of course, over a decade of austerity and privatization that has made life more expensive for working class people. Yet, there was no compensation for those who fell through the cracks, and this ultimately comes down to a fiscally conservative governance of welfare. Furloughs and stimulus checks through a conservative lens is primarily done to keep businesses afloat, and throughout the pandemic, Rishi has approached government spending with a business-centric viewpoint rather than the well-being and health of the population. This would explain his Eat Out to Help Out scheme, where participating restaurants, cafes and pubs would have foods and drinks subsidised to encourage more people to eat out. Now, there is already paramount evidence to indicate that hospitality settings are a hotspot for the spread of COVID, and this is further solidified by a study at the University of Warwick suggesting that this scheme contributed to a rise in COVID-19 infections of between 8 and 17%, quite possibly having a large influence in creating the second wave. Though the most remarkable decision that confirms Rishi's insensitivity over the well-being of the general population was ending the £20 uplift on universal credit. The pandemic has pushed 700,000 below the poverty line, with food bank usage rising by a third. To the poorest families in the UK, the extra £20 enabled them to more comfortably put basic food on the table without having to skip meals and have the choice to heat their homes in the winter, especially given the rise in food bills and heating costs. As someone who doesn't even have the faintest idea of what poverty is like, Rishi nonchalantly dismissed these concerns, moulding this into a "we need to incentivize work" argument, as if it is desirable to live on benefits, especially under these conditions. Now, as alluded to several times in this video, this disproportionately targets ethnic minorities who are more prone to live in impoverished neighbourhoods. But Rishi doesn't care. It was obvious from his early days as Chancellor that the Tory party was priming Rishi up to be the next Prime Minister, and everything he engaged in was for his own glory. With his fanatical anti-poor and anti-worker mindset, Rishi is pulling the strings to cater to the interests of himself and other wealthy elites. While economic failure under his decisions have quite possibly hurt his leadership campaign at the time, he doesn't have to face the major material consequences of his actions. Just like how he doesn't have to face the consequences of his wife's family business financially contributing to Putin's regime in Ukraine. Something that Rishi hasn't condemned or even apologized for, despite putting on a facade of solidarity for Ukraine. Rishi values his own glory so much that upon falling behind the laughable political lightweight and former Prime Minister Liz Truss, he sought to pander to the ultra-right by proposing a bunch of regressive culture war garbage that includes attacks on the LGBT+ community and practically anything that the right deems as quote-unquote woke. To those South Asians who are championing Rishi as if the mere racial connection automatically means he's representative of you and your interests, well, you better be wealthy, willing to stay quiet about bigotry you've faced, and any accurate depiction of British history. Otherwise, Rishi doesn't care about you. Ultimately, when it comes to wealthy politicians like Rishi and Kwasi, they are infinitely closer to those who share their class than any other identity. While they are not immune to facing discrimination on the basis of race or religion, their predisposed capital mitigates many barriers that working class and even middle class minorities would have to overcome. Matters such as having an easier time getting employed and not having to go the extra mile to look and sound eloquent, because society deems your natural image as unprofessional, typically leading upper class and ruling class minorities to be out of touch. The last politician we will be looking at is Nadhim Zahawi, who has served in various cabinet positions, yet his notoriety is upheld by actions unrelated to his political duties. One of the most key exhibits of this, other than founding the market research and data analytics firm YouGov, was his work for Gulf Keystone Petroleum, a British oil company operating in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Here Nadhim was hired in 2015 to be the Chief Strategy Officer with the responsibility of negotiating regular payments from the Kurdistan regional government, in which he was paid $1.3 million by Gulf Keystone over the span of 3 years. Zahawi was also the vice chair of a cross-party parliamentary group which essentially lobbies on behalf of Gulf Keystone Petroleum to ensure good relations between the UK and the Kurdistan region of Iraq so they can continue to extract oil and do business. In the same year Zahawi worked for Gulf Keystone Petroleum, Kurdistan was hit by an economic crisis caused by lower global oil prices due to supply exceeding demand, as well as the expansion of the Islamic State posing a threat to oil facilities that deterred foreign investment. As a region that is almost entirely reliant on the oil industry, when the KRG was seeing less revenue, they decided to enact policies of austerity that has resulted in high unemployment, lower standards of living than the rest of Iraq, and hundreds and thousands of people seeking asylum in Europe. Despite this, I was unable to find Nadhim voice concerns on this matter, which is rather interesting since one of the purposes of the cross-party parliamentary group that I mentioned earlier is to promote friendship and understanding between the people of the Kurdistan region in Iraq and the UK. Now, obviously, it doesn't take a genius to understand that this is just disingenuous horseshit, and the development of democratic institutions in the Kurdistan region is the real interest of the politicians involved. What makes this worse is that just like every other Tory, Nadhim voted in favour of Priti's anti-refugee bill, which is quite sickening as someone who gives unequivocal praise to the UK for his prosperity while dismissing other Kurdish citizens from the opportunity to have a fraction of what he has. When questioned on the topic of refugees in a Channel 4 interview, he kept reiterating that he was an immigrant to distance himself from refugees and falsely implied that many asylum seekers that were getting turned away were from safe countries like France. The fact that Nadhim owns over £25 million in property, with some reports going up to £100 million, while every year thousands of Kurds embark on dangerous journeys in search of a better life, is beyond distasteful. And yet, he had the gall to speak out against Trump's Muslim ban only when it personally affected him.
The first time in my life, last night, I felt discriminated against. It's demeaning, it's sad.
The truth of the matter is that despite Nadhim profiting from his identity and connections, he doesn't care for average Kurdish citizens. Despite fleeing to the UK for a better life, he doesn't care for refugees and asylum seekers. Other than a lack of compassion that is required to be a Tory, this can be attributed to the fact that he is so disconnected from the struggles of the less fortunate, even though he deceivingly presents himself as a rags to riches success story. After all, this is a multi-millionaire embroiled in numerous tax affairs who even uses taxpayers' money to claim expenses for energy bills while ironically engaging in policies that make living more expensive for the working class. An ideology that preserves the hierarchical structure of modern feudalism with the illusion of upward mobility is an ideology that will always seek to exploit the less fortunate, irrespective of cultural allegiances shared with the ruling class. This ultimately gives rise to malicious practices where the ruling class will act in their own interest as self-serving opportunists who are out of touch with the vast majority and want nothing more than to satisfy their own gluttony. So next time you hear a politician say something to the effect of,
that under this government we have the most diverse cabinet in the history of this country.
remember that this is just a way to deflect any valid criticism and make right-wing minority politicians seem grounded to the reality of average minorities, while their politics offer nothing unique compared to their default white counterparts.